Hey, my name is Zach Dames, and in this video, I'm going to talk to you about what the exposure triangle is and how to use it so you can start taking better photos today. So what exactly is the exposure triangle? Well, it's made up of three components: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So let's take a look at the first one. So when it comes to ISO, when you adjust it, you're adjusting how sensitive your camera is to light. So for example, if we have ISO 100, compared to ISO 6400, ISO 6400 is going to produce a lot more light in your photo or video. So let's take a look at the two sample images. In the first one of this pocket knife, we have ISO 100. As you can see, it's pretty dark. Now, in the second photo, we have ISO 6400, and there's a ton more light coming in. Now, when adjusting your ISO, there's something very important to keep in mind, and that is the higher ISO you go, the more noise and grain you could be introducing into your photo or video. Now, each camera is different, so I would recommend going up to the search bar above and searching for the specific model of your camera to find out what the low light limitations are. So that way, you're not out and about shooting some great photos, and then you come home to edit them on the computer, and you see that you went way too high on your ISO, and you've got a lot of noise and grain in your photos. Now let's take a look at aperture. So aperture controls two things: the amount of light and also the amount of background blur. When you adjust your aperture, you're actually adjusting a ring inside of the lens that's made up of a series of blades. Now what that means is, if you were to have your aperture set to f1.8, the ring is going to be very big, and it's going to let in a lot of light, and it's also going to create a lot of background blur. Now if you were to take your aperture and put it up to f22, the ring is going to be very small. Now what that's going to do is it means you're going to have a lot less light and a lot less background blur. So let's take a look at two sample photos I took. The first one is at f1.8, and as you can tell, the background is extremely blurry. You can't even tell what the sign says or anything. Now in the second photo, I raised it to f11. Now we can see a lot more detail in the background, and the background's not nearly as blurred as it was to f1.8. So think about it in terms of, it's kind of backwards. So the smaller the number, like f1.8, equals a really big ring, which gives you a lot of light, a lot of background blur. But if you have a big number, like f22, it's actually really small, which gives you a little bit of light and only a little bit of background blur. And lastly, we'll take a look at shutter speed. Now, shutter speed controls two things as well. It controls how much light you have in your photo, and then it also controls the amount of motion blur. Now, when you adjust your shutter speed, you're actually adjusting how quickly the shutter in your camera opens and closes. So, for example, if your shutter is set to 1 second, your shutter will open 1 Mississippi and then close. Whereas if the shutter speed was set to like 1/800 of a second, I can't even demonstrate how fast that would be. I'm not Bruce Lee, but it'd be very, very fast. Now, what that does is, if you have a super fast shutter speed, you're gonna have a lot less light coming into your sensor. But you'll also have a lot less motion blur. Whereas if you have a slow shutter speed, like let's say 1 second or even 4 seconds, it's going to let in a ton of light, but you're going to have a lot of motion blur if there's anything moving in the photo. So let's take a look at two photos I took. So the first photo was set at 1/60th of a second. Now I took the camera, pointed at the roof, and quickly brought the camera and panned the camera down vertically. So as you can tell in the first photo, when it's set at 160, there is a ton of motion blur. Now in the second photo, it's a lot more clear, and that's because I boosted the shutter speed. I put the shutter speed up to 1/800th of a second, and as you can tell, when I vertically pan the camera down quickly, it's able to retain a lot more detail than it did at the much slower shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. Okay, so that's the exposure triangle. Now that you know what it is, you're probably wondering, well, how do I know how to manipulate it when I'm out in the field taking photos? Well, the best way I can explain this to you is to show you an example. So let's look at it like this. Let's say we're at a high school football game, right? Now, when I show up to the field to shoot photos, there are three things that are going through my head. Number one is, what's my subject matter? Okay, so football players and cheerleaders, right? That means that there's going to be a lot of movement, a lot of action. It's going to be a very fast-paced event. Secondly, I'm looking at my environment. So let's say it's about 5 or 6 p.m. in the evening. What that means is that there's not going to be as much light as there would, say, if it was high noon. So that's my environment. So there's a little bit of light left, but not a whole lot of light left. And the third thing that's going through my head is how much background blur do I want? Or how separated do I want the football player to be from the crowd? And those are the three things that are gonna be going through my head. So right off the bat, the first thing I'm doing is I'm adjusting my shutter speed, right? Because I want a really high shutter speed because I don't want there to be any motion blur. So I'm gonna set my shutter speed to, like, let's say 1 in 1,000th or 1 in 800th of a second. Now remember, it's super fast shutter speed, so that's gonna let in a lot less light. And I don't want to mess with my aperture too much. I like the amount of background blur I have. Let's say my aperture is at like f2.8. That's a good amount of blur where I can still see the crowd and it's not gonna be crazy separated with background blur, but there's gonna be a really good amount of background blur. So I like that, so I'm not gonna mess with my aperture. I like how much background blur I have. So that means I have to now go to my ISO. So I'm gonna take my ISO, and I know the limitations of my camera. I know how high I can go before I start introducing any noise or grain into my photo. And so I can then adjust my ISO appropriately till I have the correct exposure. And that's really all there is to it. It's just a matter of getting familiar with how the components of the exposure triangle work. So the best thing I can recommend is that you just go out and practice. Take some photos at different times of the day and get used to it. Get used to, what's the difference between ISO 400 and 100, get to know the subtle little differences, and that's the only way that you're gonna get really confident when you're out there taking photos in manual mode. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really truly hope it helped you out to better understand the exposure triangle so you can go out there and start taking some awesome photos. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to click the thumbs up button. And if you want to see more photo and video content like this, be sure to check out my channel. And if you really like it, go ahead and subscribe. It's completely free. It just means that you're going to stay up to date with all the vlogs that I do, all the tutorials, and the short films that I have coming soon. So be sure you click subscribe so you can stay completely up to date with everything that I've got going on here. But anyways, my name is Zach Dames. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.